Research Center's Internet and American Life project, and I have the fun job of interviewing a whole bunch of interesting people here. It started yesterday, continues today, there will be more people tomorrow, and I always begin these things with my conflict of interest disclosures. There are a couple of things. I'm about to go back to the hotel later on this evening, get a fax and sign it so that the Pew Internet Project can work with Danah and some others in applying for a federal grant to look at some aspects of teenage behavior online. So we are soon to be partners, we hope, in something that will be fun and exciting. And I was thinking as she was speaking today, in my Facebook references, I think I would put Danah as my #1 like reference for social network researchers. Her work has taught us stuff. We've ripped off from it. Sometimes we've actually collaborated and given her credit for what we've ripped off for her. She's been our teacher for a long time on this stuff, and so it's fun to be with her, and really, in my sense, it's an honor to be with her. So I thought I'd start with some questions that flowed out of the wonderful speech she gave this morning. And I wonder if, you sounded so many cautionary notes about big data research. I wonder if there are people or institutions or organizations that are doing it right, that you've seen that handle the data the right way, have come up with conclusions that you find credible and relevant and that sort of match up with the world that you see in your own work.
Sure. I mean, it's really tricky. One of the funny things about research is that it always lags a little bit behind what happens out sort of in land of amateur fun with data type stuff. I'm actually excited by different projects that are trying to make a point. How many of you saw Please Rob Me? Okay, so Please Rob Me was this really entertaining site that says, look, all of this location data is being put out there. And so we're going to just stream it and pull it on a website that says, Please Rob Me, and it's this reminder of how much data is there. And it's a really interesting thing, because at first people thought that this site was somehow serious, right? Like, please come rob these people. And in fact, it was actually trying to make a point about privacy, which was a really delightful point. They're trying to now sell it to various privacy organizations to think about that. That to me is a kind of experiment that I think really gets at this. I also think, part of it is these moments of reflection. So one of the things I think really differentiates, say, Twitter from what's going on with Facebook is that Twitter becomes really clear that this has a certain publicness to it, and the trending topics ended up being a very good reminder of that. It also, of course, ended up turning into a gameplay. And I think it's really interesting to see how the trending topics originally reflected the norms of the common things that were being said in Twitter and turned into a thing of itself. And became a way in which the participants became part of the conversation of how public this material is. To the point where I spend a lot of my day looking at when teenagers game these things. I'm particularly fond of the Yo Mama culture that has sort of emerged out of this, with trending topics like Whip My Refund Check, which was started by a black comedian to make comments about how white people perceive black people. And of course, this turned into a trending topic and was part of it. And so part of what ends up happening with big data is these moments where they become a reflection. They go back and forth. The analysis of big data becomes trickier, right? And the challenge that we always have is and I actually think researchers who've been working in privacy, like Alessandro Acquisti is amazing at doing this, reminding you of just how certain data, which you think is anonymous, can actually be aggregated to do different things without revealing it himself. He does a fantastic job, along with his colleagues at CMU, of a lot of this work. And I think the most recent publications about the reminder of how you can actually get to people's sexuality from Facebook. Or you can make sort of guesses about this. Again, as a research endeavor that reminds us of this without necessarily giving it away. And I think that's where the research, most that I've seen that's very good, is saying, look, okay, I have access to this data. This data makes me very uncomfortable, but let me actually make certain that when I make a comment, I make it clear that this is problematic. And I think that's actually a really nice space that's happening in research.
It sounded like there were bad instances and bad actors in this space that you were thinking about as you were sounding the cautionary notes you did today, particularly in the marketing community. Do you want to talk a little bit about abusers, misusers, or the misuses of it, if you don't want to name names?
It's interesting. Most of the misuse is unintentional. Like, it's a level of naivety that actually gets us into trouble the most. And that's actually one of the reasons why when I give these talks is about trying to sound awareness notes. an example that I gave at the South by Southwest talk on a similar topic, which, for those of you who are interested in this, I really recommend reading that talk as well, was a case that I thought was really interesting. It was a young woman who, she and her mother moved 3,000 miles away from the abusive father who had been jailed. And he was let out from jail, but he was not allowed to have access to his daughter. And his daughter was doing everything possible to hide from anybody who might get this information back. But at the same time, she was your average teenager. So she really wanted to be a part of the social group at her new school, wanted to make friends. So she wanted to make a Facebook, and she really negotiated with her mother and with various other folks to try to build a Facebook that was as secure and private as possible. And she turned off everything. They sat and went through all the settings. They were extremely cautious about it. In December, she had no idea what she was doing. She clicked on through. And the only reason why she found out was that somebody who wasn't supposed to know where she was, in this case it was not her father, contacted her, right? And these are the kinds of moments where I go, right? And the family is sort of running around being like, has he found where they are? How is this information going to get back? What does it mean? There's a lot of reasons. I spent 8 years doing work on domestic violence and anti-violence against women and girls work. There's a lot of reasons as to why people do active hiding for their own safety and protection. And I keep hearing horror cases from those communities of how this pops up and how things do it. Do I think that anybody at Facebook intended to hurt this girl? Absolutely not. But I think that the level of privilege and arrogance that ends up happening because we think that everybody's lives are as wonderful as ours are, as privileged as ours, gets us into trouble. And so one of the challenges in this space for me is that each individual company and researcher really does genuinely mean well, but doesn't necessarily start to think about all of the problematic consequences of it. And so the challenge, I think, is to actually start thinking like a hacker, to start thinking about all of the ways in which that data will get misused and all of the unintended possibilities. And this is the weird thing that we expect of teenagers all the time, right? We expect that teenagers should think about what their lives are going to be like 15 years from now when they're, when they're out in the workforce and imagining the futures. But we who are giving that advice never take it ourselves. We look at this data and we don't think about our privilege and the ability to look at this. And so more than anything, it's not so much that I think individual groups are evil or malintended, although there are some. I think most of it is naivety and not thinking through the possible problems here.
I wonder if you have thought through how researchers in particular might allow for context, how context could be built into the kinds of things they study, or as I was listening to you today and this sort of large-scale problems that you have about context being stripped away in big data sets, whether that essentially shuts down the operation, that in effect you can never take full account of context. You can never put data in this set of circumstances in which you can fully understand its meaning. And I assume you're not arguing that research ought to completely shut down for that reason, but I wonder if you have a set of principles or a set of ideas about how to take account for that so that even with unintended consequences, people's well-meaningness can actually be advanced at the earliest stages of their research as they're encountering data.
Right. I mean, number one principle is really goes back to a lot of the methodological stuff I said at the beginning. Know what data you're working with and what the issues are with that data, and don't make claims that go beyond that. Another thing is, and especially for all the computationally minded in this room, there are a lot of social scientists who are trying to work through these spaces. This is an amazing opportunity for collaboration. Of course, I understand the challenges with this, right? And the publishers are not making that easier at all, and all of the incentives for how to get tenure and all of that drama that is classic academia. But I think there's a lot to be said about making collaborative efforts so that you can be doing multi-pronged questioning. So you can say, okay, what are the issues here, and how do we balance it out? And realize that your IRBs are not at all prepared to be asking the tough questions of this. And that's why it's like, instead of waiting for them to magically come back with those annoying reports that none of you like anyhow, actually go and reach out to social scientists and have conversations where you together work out the ethics of this. The other thing is really pointing out where the limitations are and what goes on. I also really think it's important to really say, this is what I can say and this is what I can't say with any of the data that I have. There's a weird tendency in quantitative work to only make the claims about what you can say. There's something that really has to be moved about what you also can't say, and really going through that and saying what the limitations of these arguments are without trying to extrapolate to big ideas with everything, and really make that clear. In terms of working through with the data itself, also really think through what that data is that you're hosting on your servers, what it means, how you actually quote things. A classic IRB frustration of mine is that they go out of their way to tell you to anonymize everybody that you reference, right? This is sort of a beautiful thing. Except the time that when you want to give somebody credit for what they're saying, right? So part of it is knowing when somebody wants credit for their speech. And this often means talking to people whose data that you're actually quoting. Another big issue is that they say, oh, well, you have to anonymize the people, but you don't have to anonymize the text. Anybody with a search engine can get back to the people through the text. So you have to really think about when you're quoting things and think about the ethics of how you're doing that, how you become a source of identifiability and embarrassment in very particular ways. And so really, these are the questions, the hard questions that IRBs should be asking and realistically aren't asking, and need to be part of the way in which you actually think about how to do research. And when you put systems out there that put data up there, think about how you would go through opt-out policies and opt-in policies, depending on what kind of material you're putting out there. Just because you can scrape Twitter to the end of the earth, if you put something out there that puts that data back, how are people going to be misusing this? How will this get misinterpreted? How much do you become part of this process? And when and where are you accountable for it? And I think that's all part of the questions of science. And it's interesting to see that Henry Jenkins just gave his goodbye talk at MIT after 20 years of being at MIT. And it was one of the most delightfully entertaining talks. But one of the things that he said in his talk was he reminded us that when Draper Labs at MIT was doing sort of hard science during the war, that they actually involved all sorts of humanists to think through ethical questions. And I think we keep talking about interdisciplinary work, but we don't do a lot to actually work out and think about the fact that ethics are a conversation that has been happening in philosophy, a conversation that's been happening in social science for a long time. And I think that as we start to play in this data, we need to be making those bridges and not just waiting for social scientists to come to us because we have data, but finding a way to actually really actively engage that. And it becomes a local issue, right? I can't give you these big tropes of this is how you have to do it for all data sets. It becomes very local with what data sets you're working through, and it becomes a way in which you have to critically think through the process as opposed to a set of check boxes that you need to fill off.
Let's talk about the land of teenagers that you inhabit. You have any number of wonderful insights into it. One of my favorites is that you talk about teenagers writing themselves into being. Mm-hmm. And now it's really creating themselves into being with pictures and videos and stuff like that. Would you talk a little bit about the ways in which you see teenagers navigating this environment, particularly in the context of their social networks, and how it's different from the experience that those of us of a certain age might have had as teenagers? One of your lines today was that human nature isn't necessarily very mutable. And yet, it strikes me that the environment in which teenagers are now living, and you have argued that it is changing some aspects of the way that they engage each other and engage their wider community. So I'm interested in your sense of difference now and then.
So teenagers are, basically as the process of coming of age, they look to try to understand the public world around them. And when they look to understand it, they try to see, what are all of the structural conditions? And most people think teenagers are completely illogical, and they're not. They're actually making very rational decisions based on the constraints that they're working with and the environment that they understand for the incentives and desires that they have. And so when they're looking at a lot of social spaces, they're like, okay, how can I be cool? Very simple question, right? Like, how do I look good before my peers? How do I gain social status? How do I get the kind of feedback and friendship that I want to manage? And part of it is, as they engage in this social media, they come to it with all of these expectations, these social ideas. Not with a preformed understanding of public life, but with an understanding of friendship being important and driving a lot of their social participation. Part of why they make themselves, or put a lot of data out to be publicly accessible, is that they want to be seen as very cool to their peers. And they're very invested in that. They're very invested in getting attention at varying levels. And the challenge is that you keep coming back to them, and I, when I interview them and I talk to different teens about how they manage privacy, they'll talk about how it's really important that they get to see, that their friends can see them, but really important that also those who hold power over them can't see them. And this is something that we often take for granted in real weird ways, which is that as adults, by and large, when we think about those who hold power over us, we think primarily of bosses, right? And work separate. And if we keep work separate, life will be great. Well, the fact is, teenagers are constantly thinking about parents. They're thinking about teachers. They're thinking about the local law enforcement. They're thinking about college admissions officers once they're getting to a certain age. But this group of people is really challenging because these people think that they have the right to look at teenagers wherever teenagers are. And teenagers are constantly lamenting the fact that they have no privacy in the home. I found it really interesting in my fieldwork that I kept coming back to teenagers saying that home was not a private space, but online was. It's like, okay, whoa, where does that come from? Where is that logic? And part of it is this mindset that, my parents feel like they can come into my room whenever they want, whereas I have to do games to blockade them. This is not new, right? We had nice little signs we put on the room, keep out, right? This is this ongoing process of trying to actually control space. The same ends up happening online, but we see this constant move. We also see parents saying, well, if it's publicly accessible, I have the right to look. And teenagers being like, no, you don't have the right to look. This is my space. And this is where we get this really interesting tension playing out. So I think that, as we see teenagers coming of age, we also have to think that they're also accounting for all that they have to gain from participating. Adults are really funny because by and large, generalizably, adults are thinking about all that they have to lose. And that is a very different set of mindsets about engaging in social media. And I say it's generalizable because there are teenagers who start to think about what they have to lose. And I should note that those teenagers are usually the most privileged within society. Those who are applying to an Ivy League, those who parents are pressuring them to apply to an Ivy League, they're thinking about what they have to lose. I had a really painfully interesting conversation with a young woman who was putting out semi-naked photos of herself as a teenager, and I was like, so why are you doing this? And she started accounting for me all of the celebrities that had become famous by doing this. And I'm sitting here going, oh. I said, well, and I was asking her, I was like, well, aren't you worried about, you might not be able to get a job or you might not be able to get into college? She's like, you think I'm going to be able to get into college anyhow? And I was like, okay. And she's like, I'm going to become famous. That's my only way out. I was like, okay, we got to work within that. We got to understand all of those different dimensions and the ways in which it's massively diverse across these groups. And the big question on the table, of course, what she was doing was illegal. It's fundamentally and by the law child pornography, which is going to get her into trouble in unbelievable ways. But it's not just when we come in when there's a law that's a problem. We have to think about how to help young people work through all these norms. And I think that's one of the things, parents and educators can do a lot to help young people think through, and by asking questions. What are you doing? How are you thinking through it? And guiding it accordingly. The technology is changing these things. There's no doubt about it. But the intentions that teenagers are coming into these things with actually do make sense. And if you follow that logic, you can see where the disconnects are.
I'm going to pick up on a strain of that where you have been among the leaders writing about class and technology use and why the research community in many respects has neglected that as a framing of lots of their analysis. Yeah. So talk about your thoughts about how socioeconomic factors play through the way that teenagers engage technology and the way that adults understand the way they engage technology.
Sure. So one of the best and worst things about my research is I get this bright idea that I should put things out while they're still baking in my head. And I learned the hard way that talking about socioeconomic status and class in the United States is the best way to get a bullseye placed on you. So in July of 2007, actually June of 2007, I wrote an essay noting a pattern that I started seeing amongst teenagers, a division that was happening at the time between MySpace and Facebook. A division that was happening both functionally, in terms of kids choosing one or the other, but also rhetorically, in the ways in which they were narrating one or the other. And I talked about it in terms of class. This ended up getting massively covered, unfortunately, by the BBC as a formal report from Berkeley, also a way to get in trouble with your institution. And but the result of this is that I got constant feedback from adults about how I was a terrible, terrible person. And all of these teenagers came out of the woodwork telling me their stories of what was going on in their school. And I found something very interesting in the rhetorical styles of what was going on. You'd hear a discussion about Facebook and MySpace, about MySpace being, bling and fashionable and beautiful and colorful, it being gaudy and ugly and, and design-wise terrible. Facebook being elegant and simple and easy to manage and private. Facebook being boring and lame and a control freak-esque, right? And that these divisions in language were very much correlated to where kids stood on a socioeconomic level. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. But what one of the teenagers who saw my essay pointed out was that it wasn't just about that. It was about a shift that happened from MySpace to Facebook. Which teenagers shifted from MySpace to Facebook and why? And one of the things that she pointed out is that that shift also had a socioeconomic division in it. And that shift had to do with a rhetoric of safety, a rhetoric of privacy, a rhetoric that fit into what in the United States we actually see as similar patterns in our old style rhetoric, and not actual practice, but rhetoric of white flight. And so I was really startled by looking at this, and I wrote a paper on this that I'm happy to share with whoever. So I was trying to sit and sift through all of these languages and the ways in which people were talking about it. And mind you, one of the things I love teenagers now are like, ugh, the MySpace people have totally invaded Facebook. And you're like, whoa, okay, what does that actually mean? And how do we work through this? Socioeconomic divisions are tricky because the thing is that by and large, we've assumed that only certain groups of people have had access to technology. Access is now, as the organization has pointed out brilliantly, gone pretty mainstream. But the participation is variable in all sorts of complex ways. And what we see, especially when we look at network structures, is actually very homophilous. We only see certain worlds, and we're often not aware of how to actually interpret and make sense of the worlds that aren't part of our position. And especially, I mean, as researchers with degrees, many of them, often with 3 letters, right? We are in a very different position than a lot of the participants that we are actually observing. And I think that's actually where we get back to some of these privacy conversations and some of these questions here, because in some ways, these decisions about how to navigate this require skill, right? This goes back to Esther Hargitai's fantastic work on socioeconomic divisions, but it also goes back to all the experiences that you have in your social norms and the social worlds that you live in, and that these are extremely variable. And again, I point back to Twitter's trending topics as a way in which we're seeing this. I find the race and class conversations on Twitter are really fascinating. And yet we keep coming back in the news and in research about this is a place for news and information sharing. And yet if you actually look at a lot of the data, that's not how people are using it. So the other big question is the questions you're asking when you ask into the research, how much does your own position, your socioeconomic position, your race, your ethnicity, your nationality, your gender, how much are these inflecting the questions that you're asking? And one of the things about ethnographic research is that the role is to actually start with the people and figure out how to go up from there. Grounded theory, right? How can we theorize based on what is making sense of it? And one of the things I invite you to do when you're engaging with big data, start on the ground. Don't ask necessarily the levels of conversations the ethnographers are saying, and don't think you're doing ethnography, but start to actually observe what's happening so you see a diversity of things that are going on beyond you. Because we get very myopic about our engagement in a lot of these spaces.
Does Facebook ever want to talk to you? Have you talked to Facebook? It's established now whenever there's a panic about a new policy at Facebook in one form or another that's manifesting itself, you're on everybody's Rolodex to comment on that. And I wonder, some tech companies are very happy to engage even their most severe critics, and I wonder about you and Facebook.
It's interesting. I've had relationships with different people at Facebook over the years. My closest ally in these conversations was always Chris Kelly, who was the chief privacy officer for a long time. We talked extensively for a total of his tenure there. Chris has left. Mark Zuckerberg and I disagree. We have disagreed actively in person and professionally for quite some time. I have nothing but great respect for a lot of the engineers. I have amazing respect for Cameron Marlowe and a lot of the work he's trying to do. But part of it is the difference between individual conversations and thinking about collective and thinking about their decision making. I am not in any conversation with decision makers at this point. I can't be, right? Functionally, my bills are paid for by Microsoft Research at this point. Facebook doesn't want to talk to me about their decisions going forward. That's fine, I respect that. My goal in talking to a lot of engineers there is to say, hey, can you think through these issues and pushing people to think through them. I don't think that Mark will, I have to admit, I woke up this morning to the latest news report saying that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't care about privacy. And I'm like, oh, please, do we not do this? I think a lot of people inside Facebook do actually care about these issues. The people that I know do. And the question is, how do you as a company figure out how to aggregate what people are going on and ask the hard questions? And I think the challenge, if anybody who has never worked inside a company, companies are really multi-tentacles, right? They go in all sorts of different directions, and people aren't always even aware of it. So when I make a critique against Facebook, it's not necessarily a critique against individuals. A lot of the individuals are making reasonable decisions across that, but in aggregate, there are problems. And I think that there's something very important about checks and balances of this. One of the best, when I used to work at Google, and one of the best things that we did back then was actually show the EFF a lot of early stage things privately to actually get critical feedback from the outside.
That's the Electronic Frontier Foundation of Privacy Advocacy.
And that was actually amazing to be able to have an outside conversation. I don't think that I can be that outside interlocutor at this point for Facebook, but I do think that Facebook needs to be engaging with outside interlocutors before they launch things. And I think that this is generally true of all of these companies working in these spaces. If any of you are working in the spaces of privacy, Epic, I'm terrible at actually remembering acronyms. So Epic, look that one up, you've got computers. Thank you. Electronic Privacy Information Center, they're fantastic for bouncing ideas off. The ACLU, another acronym, American Civil Liberties Union, and the EFF are really fantastic for bouncing these ideas off. And that's actually where having those outside folks, the other thing is, all companies dog food their software, and they think that internally they can make assessments based on how their users internally will use it. When you're dealing with social stuff, it looks very different outside of your company than it ever looks internally. Dog fooding is not enough in the social space. It's great for doing baseline HCI, basically does this actually, what's the interaction paradigm? It's terrible for thinking about the diversity. And so part of the challenge for companies working in those spaces to figure out who on their outside that they can bounce things off of, how they actually go and roll out tests so they make certain that there's a lot of checks and balances before they do things en masse. But it's really tricky when we're all moving at the pace we're moving.
And the last question I'm going to ask before I open it up to other questions sort of elevates it. It applies very much to teenagers, but all the rest of us are now implicated in the sort of the big thought that you organized your earliest scholarship around, network publics. We all live as networkers in a variety of publics with different relationships to those publics, different aspects of our identity tied to them, different feelings about the community that they represent. Share the insights that you've gained about how people navigate this world, both successfully and unsuccessfully. Where do people trip up in it, and where do people shine in it?
Sure. So my argument about network publics comes from a sort of philosophical discussion about publics. And you'll note that I say publics, not public. That's very intentional. We always live in multiple publics, and we're always navigating these ideas of publics. Right? You wandering around this conference inside, outside, this is one public. And a lot of the norms that you have, how you can have conversations, they have a certain logic to them because of the expectations of this community. And part of it is that we engage with publics differently. We make different assumptions about it. There's some really great work done by Joshua Meyerowitz called No Sense of Place. And it was about television. And it was about how television complicated publics. By forcing us into one. And one of the best examples that he gives is the story of Stokely Carmichael. He was a civil rights activist in the United States who used to go and give very different talks to very different audiences, not unlike a lot of our politicians. And he would give different talks using very different rhetorical styles. When he would speak before politicos in DC, he would use a very proper, posh, educated way of speaking. When he would go and speak before Southern black congregations, he would use a rolling pastoral style that at that time was considered to be absolutely horrifying to white society. In 1968, he was forced to go on television and radio. And there was no way in which he could have a neutral voice, no way in which he could be heard to multiple audiences in ways that made sense. He made a decision, and to this day, black power is seen as very anti-white in really complex ways in the history of civil rights in the US. Part of it is that even television, which did this sort of broadcast out component, gave us the sense that we would have to deal with all of the complexities. Context collapse is one component of it. Another component of it is invisible audiences. There's a camera behind there, right? I have a sense of how you guys are paying attention. You're nodding, you're not following along. I assume we're in dub as a context. I have no idea who's behind that camera, who's looking at it, why they're looking at it, if they understand English, if they have any idea of the references that I'm making, if they heard my talk, none whatsoever. That has the ability to be taken out of context in all sorts of interesting and complicated ways. But I make these adjustments according to you. Networked publics are about the challenges that people face in the ways in which we think about television, a lot of what Meyerowitz is setting up, and the ways in which we deal with it every day, all the time. When we engage in network media, we have to deal with the complexities, context collapse, blurring of public and private, the challenges of invisible audiences. And part of it comes down to the fact that the network publics, and the reason I use that marker is to say there are 4 key properties that we always have to take into account that radically change what goes on in things. One is persistence. We take ephemerality for granted whenever we're interacting in interpersonal ways. Persistence actually changes a lot of that, and that's a networked property that becomes critical. Replicability, the ability to copy and paste text from one place to another, becomes something that is part and parcel with engaging online. That makes it very tricky to not just see how far things will spread, but also the ability to actually modify things and not know the original and the changes. Another challenge in this is searchability. My mother would have loved the ability to scream grep and figure out where I had been with my friends. She couldn't. I am thankful for this. What does it mean that people become extremely searchable online? How does searchability take things out of context, and how do we deal with that? Another issue is scale. There's an assumption that everything scales to millions. That's not true. But the fact that some things do is what messes this all up. Most things don't scale. Any politician trying to actually gain a large audience finds that things don't magically scale. It's not the field of dreams. But figuring out what scales, how it scales, and realizing that what scales is usually embarrassing, humiliating, grotesque, sexual, or all of the other things where we go, oh no, right? And how do we deal with the scalability of all of that? That is core with what the network publics give us, and part of figuring out how to work in these environments is to figure out how to deal with those properties and affordances, and to deal with all of the ways in which we deal the complex changes of the publics. Young people are growing of age, they're making sense of it to the best of their ability. Adults are making sense of it terribly, but telling the teenagers that they know better than they do. The fact is, we're in a transition, right? We're trying to make sense of these things. It's really unstable. It will be unstable for a long time. People will lose their jobs over this. People will lose their lives over this. And the question is that it becomes a big challenge. How do we look at these changes as they're in transition and make certain that we're really respectful of people across the path?
You guys have a crack at asking questions now. There's a microphone here, just beyond the view of the camera, I should point out.
You get to hide.
And so, why don't you come to the microphone and ask Danah stuff that you wished you'd asked or been able to ask at her keynote or now.
Dr. Ward, I was wondering if you could speak to how you see social networking across cultures, the first world, the developing world, the third world. How does this look compared to your study of American teenagers?
Mm-hmm. So social network sites in various forms are being picked up across a lot of different places. Right now, we're talking about the most technologically savvy places and the most technologically savvy people. But the diversity shows a lot of cultural reflections. One of the most interesting differences that I love is the Korean use of Cyworld. And this is a social network site with a lot of its own sort of interesting peculiarities. But one of the things that's baked into Cyworld, which is kind of doesn't really make sense in an American context, is the notion of ilchon. The notion of basically being able to mark relationships based on generations effectively. And the fact that this gets marked into Cyworld is a way of actually allowing people to navigate that in particular ways. That becomes really powerful in seeing this play out. Another thing that I think is really interesting to see outside of a US context, the Americans, the Brits, and the Australians do an amazing job of being afraid of teenagers in unbelievably and unprecedented ways. Teenagers are both scary and actually must be protected in all sorts of ways. The result of which is that we actually are afraid to interact with teenagers as adults, and as adults who are parents, we don't want our kids to interact with adults because all adults are potential pedophiles. Outside of these contexts, we actually have a lot more really powerful interactions between young people and adults in a lot of social media. And that difference really has a lot to do with the cultural norms. So a lot of what you see in terms of social network sites reflects a lot of cultural stuff that plays out. What's acceptable, what's socially acceptable. We see a lot of huge gender differences that play out that have everything to do with the cultural norms there, right? In certain environments, can you friend across gender, right? What does that look like? What are the politics of that? And that looks very different. We have a lot of interesting class differences. I mean, Orchid was a beautiful example of watching India and some of its sort of class dynamics play out, and these ways in which you could mark or not mark this, right? And you can make parallels to American systems, but it's not class that's actually the narrative there. So the key to understanding social network site usage across the globe is really to understand the cultural environments there. I think this will continue to get more and more diverse as we think about people outside of the sort of most technologically elite who are participating outside of the Western societies. And I think a lot of it is paying attention to differences in different people. One of my, back in the day when I was working at Yahoo, I had a great opportunity to look at some of what was going on with Flickr. And one of my favorite conversations was a debate that happened over what was pornographic in Flickr by the users. And the debate started out with, there were a handful of Brazilians who were arguing that boobs were not pornographic, and how could they remove boobs? It was like, oh boy, here we go. And then it started in this really interesting conversation that emerged out of the United Arab Emirates about how belly buttons were pornographic. And American women sort of yelled back, saying, in Flickr, in the comments, saying, you are basically an oppressed population, you don't understand. And the women from the UAE yelled back and said, what makes you so high and mighty to think that in order to be sexually advanced, you have to reveal your bodies all over the place as though you are large sluts, right? And you can imagine where this conversation went. But it was really a really interesting dialogue between these two different cultural environments about what was normative and what wasn't. How do we even interpret things? I mean, any company that's had to decide what was obscene and what's not, you realize that the legal notion of obscenity being I know it when I see it really doesn't work. I know it when I see it only works when you're dealing with everybody like you. And once you start to think about global dynamics of this gets extremely messy. And so we're seeing all of this, sort of come into these spaces. And that's actually one of the challenges, I will say, of even in the United States, just constraining it there. The cultural differences are huge, right? The cultural differences about what's cool, what it means to show off certain things, very different. And we often read it with, the place where I see it most in the language of teenagers is through a language of racism. And a language of assumption of just like, what those people do is worse than what we do. What we do is right, that is wrong. And you see these collisions. And so that becomes part of these publics, is that they're all colliding. Right now, across the globe, Facebook is the only place where we're seeing full-on cultural collisions within it. But right now, it's been relatively constrained because people have been relatively unaware of one another. I think that this might actually get a little more complicated with all of the various changes. For those who haven't been following the various like stuff, I recommend likebutton.me, which is, if you don't log into Facebook, you can see what basically the global trending topics are in Facebook, and you start to see that this is not necessarily what you would expect. So I think we're going to see a lot more of these collisions emerge out in Facebook because of some of these changes, but I don't know what they're going to play out. But right now, language and specific sites have been the border controls of this. I don't think that will last for very long.
So in your interviews of teenagers, did you also talk with teenagers who opt out of using Facebook and other social network sites and see what makes them tick?
Yeah, no, opting out is great. So, talking about sampling this morning, I sample across teenagers, which means that I inevitably run into kids who have opted out as well. I don't sample for social network site use. And there's a couple of different logics for opting out. Some we sort of like to highlight, so I'll start with those because actually they're the rarest. Politically motivated kids who think that this is highly invasive of their privacy and are on these sort of extreme, like, go get them, the future activists of the world. They're one branch, they're small. Kids will opt out because of certain kinds of lack of technological access, either restrictions from their parents, restrictions from their schools, it's too much of a hassle, their phone doesn't do it, all sorts of reasons that they'll give of technology. Connected to the logic of technology, because interestingly, technological access issues actually don't stop people. That's usually a justification, but usually not actually what stops people. It's a justification because it's usually signal for it if you dive deeper into kids who are not part of a social world at their schools where they feel as though they could actually be cool in these sites, and they'd rather opt out and give all sorts of reasons as to why they're opting out that are technological, when in fact a lot of it has to do with social status. There are also kids who feel as though, they're too cool for that. And that can go in either way. That can go in the, they don't feel as though they're part of the world. And they also feel as though everything that's relevant will bubble up, which is also really interesting to them, where they can feel like they can remove from it. Kids at the highest level of socioeconomic practice will opt out if they're afraid of anything about their future, right? Basically, these are the kids who want to be president, and they have that sort of I'm going to be president mindset from really early on. They're an interesting cohort of just thinking, I need to stay out of this. And they do not like Facebook's various tagging and all sorts of other things that are coming out that basically bring them in. What else is sort of good?
What about harassment and bullying? I mean, are kids sort of driven out?
That would be, yes, there are some who are driven out, but it's been interesting to see how toughness is sort of a thing to stay in. I've been tracking a site called FormSpring. For those who have not been seeing FormSpring, it's a question and answer service that basically anybody can ask questions, and they can be anonymous or they can be named, and you decide which questions to answer, and you write the answers, and you put the questions and answers together, and it posts it on a reverse chronological way of your page. What's interesting, it also posts back to Facebook, so it's very connected to Facebook. The thing about FormSpring is that there's certainly questions like, what's your favorite color? Perfectly reasonable questions. What's been very interesting to me is the questions that I've been tracking that are much more bullying-esque. So, why are you such a slut? It's like, okay. What's interesting is that teenagers will answer it and post it publicly. And when I started trying to poke around as to why, right? Because they don't have to answer these. They could just delete those questions and move on, especially because they're anonymous. It becomes this way of saying, I am tough enough to stand this, even when it's personally hurting to them. So a lot of teenagers who would normally you would think would opt out because of fears of being hurt will actually stay in explicitly and continue to get attacked because they feel as though this is a way of staying tough. The gender politics of this are huge, right? And this is particularly true for girls and the various kinds of bullying that's going on with girls.
As an educator, as I'm an educator, how do you see social networking sites being used in education? Because I feel like our students don't want us to be there, but yet I feel it's also a powerful tool. So how do you balance those? Do we belong there? Should we bring them somewhere else? Should we use, I've done research on Ning to bring them to other places, but it's not where they live.
Right.
So is it important to be where they live, or do we need to respect that privacy?
So the key to social network sites is that they're social, right? And the thing is that this is like saying you want to show up at their birthday party. They don't want you there, you're not invited, et cetera, et cetera. That said, I believe that every educator who is a teacher, especially at the lower levels, should have a Facebook or MySpace, depending on your school, profile that is publicly accessible, where you are not connecting to your friends. It is a separate profile. And you give your password over to your principal, and you basically treat it as an open door policy. You never friend your students, but you invite your students to talk to you if they need to. I think we do this because it's a kind of safety that becomes very important. And I say give your password over to your principal because this should be highly visible, highly accountable. This is akin to being the open door policies at school. And I really think that segmenting your personal life as a teacher from your professional life as a teacher is one of the hardest things, but is absolutely necessary in this environment. Your personal life shouldn't come into the classroom, which is also why you shouldn't be engaging with them in that way. But making yourself present for when they need you can be extremely important. Social network sites are really tricky, and they have a role in classrooms, but I'm not convinced that the roles are actually that good. Ning is effectively a community site. It's not really a social network site. The problem with social network sites is that you have to get into all of the politics of friending. When you get into the politics of friending, you have to realize that there are people in your classroom that don't like one another. And you don't want to deal with that social messiness when you think about group assignments, when you think about the ways in which you get people talking and the ways in which they can torment each other just through the things of like, I'm not being friends with so-and-so, right? That's not worth it. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not doing things that are scholarly on their Facebooks and MySpaces. They're doing it, they're talking about their homework, right? They're hanging out, they're doing all these things. You don't need to butt into that either, right? Let them talk about their homeworks, let them do their things, but like keep a separation. In terms of the technology in the classroom, figure out what the pedagogical goal is, and to figure out whether technology can play a role in that. There's a lot of technology that can, but the social network sites and the process of friending becomes really problematic. Thing to keep in mind, the internet in its earliest stages was interest-driven, right? Usenet was organized around interests. Everybody interested in motorcycles was on rec.motorcycles, right? That was the way that this was at. Web 2.0, its radical shift in everyday practice is about moving from interest-driven mode to a friendship-driven mode. This is about the people that I care about and the people that I like. Your classroom is still interest-driven, often uninterest, but it is still organized around a topic, an activity, a purpose. Stick with the technologies that are best for doing interest-driven stuff. Figure out when and where social networking components can be relevant there, but don't try to just go to where they're trying to do friend-driven hanging out. That just makes it far too messy, and you're bound to get in trouble. But I do think presence is absolutely essential. And I think presence is essential not just for teachers, but for adults in general, of saying, look, I'm here if you need to listen, and doing some more open door policies. I think we all need to be thinking back to Jane Jacobs and all of the notions of eyes on the streets. And we all need to be present there in ways that we can acknowledge one another and that we can be there to help when kids need us. Teenagers turn to people in their lives who mean something to them when they need help. We often go back to parents as the idyllic thing that everybody should talk to. I don't know about you, but there are times when I didn't want to talk to my mom about a whole slew of things. I still don't, right? And there are adults that we turn to that are not our parents. And so being those adults who are in the lives of kids who can do it honestly, publicly, and in an accountable way becomes really, really important. And I think we need to do that and push back against some of the moral panic elements of saying all adults are bad in the lives of teenagers. Because adults are really critical in the lives of teenagers.
As a follow-up question, what do you think parents and educators' role is in teaching or helping teenagers navigate social networking and social media in a more positive aspect rather than, because I don't like it when we block things, when we force them not to do it, because they're going to learn how to do it anyways. But how do I play a role in that if I'm not in that world with them?
So the first thing is you can be in that world without being in that world with them. So meaning like you can start by saying like, know the social network site that they're using, right? Know your students, your kids, know what tools they're using, know what the technological elements are, figure it out through interacting with your friends. And then you can actually start conversations. Conversations are the critical component. Start asking the tough questions, asking the why. If kids are actually inviting you to be their friend, accept, and then when you see something that you find problematic, don't yell at them, but say, hey, I thought it was really odd that you were doing this. You know, another nice thing that I know that some parents do, which I think is actually really beautiful, is that they see something that's problematic, like a picture that's problematic, and then they'll see another picture that's right afterwards that's less problematic, and they'll comment on the second one being like, I like this one better, right? Which are these like little subtle ways of being like, right? Which there's something about those kinds of adjustments that become really critical. I think that you can ask the ethical questions. I think you can get into the tough questions about privacy. And I think you can do it through conversation without necessarily always being in their face socially. And I think this is true in general, right? You don't teach children how to actually negotiate friendships by showing up whenever they're interacting with a friend. You teach them by having conversations about that process, asking them about their day, asking them about what's going on, bringing up the hard cases, using the news as case examples and being like, how does this make you feel? And really conversing around that. And I think as an educator in a classroom, you can do a lot of conversation around the space without being in there and constantly looking at their particular content. But it does start by knowing the spaces.
So you mentioned in this session that we have the responsibility to guide teenagers in their moral decisions. Yet you also mentioned that teenagers have the right for their privacy to shut out their parents, which is meant to evade their moral judgments on the decisions. How do you resolve this conflict? And looking from the parent's perspective, how can a parent ensure that there is somebody there for the kid if there is a moral conflict and help is needed?
Right. First, as a parent, your challenge as a parent doesn't start when your kid's 16. It starts a lot earlier. And it starts about having conversations. In the very early stages, you are guiding kids through every interaction with the internet. You should be present for every interaction, just like with television, right? And that's the really early stages of it. There's a guidance, there's a conversation. There will be a point in which your children turn away from you as the primary guidance. The question is, have you set in motion all of these other adults that they can turn to? Do they have an aunt? Do they have an older cousin that you trust? That don't come to you for every little snitch of a moment of when something has gone wrong. They're not going to tell you when your kid suddenly decided to smoke, right? They're going to tell you when something is majorly wrong, and they're going to be there and be helpful. Setting that up, setting up other adults in your kids' lives is something extremely important from a very early age. And they will turn to them naturally when they figure out who they can trust, who they identify with, who makes sense in their world. It's also important that if they're bonding with teachers, encouraging that and allowing that to sort of gives heads up. PTA meetings are saying, hey, look, I'm just going to let you know my kid really likes you and may turn to you for things just please watch out for my kid. Figuring that out as a system, and that's one of the things we have to do it much more consciously. It wasn't so conscious when we weren't living in such very controlled houses of separate families. When we had a removal of generations in such a specific way. Age segregation has made a lot of this much harder. So setting that in motion. In huge chunks of the country, you have to look around who are those people to turn to. I spend a lot of time dealing with religious folks who, it's about youth ministers, it's about pastors, it's about all sorts of religious groups that become really important. Figuring out who those are as the trustworthy adults. The idea with helping kids and having a moral responsibility to help kids is not that you have to invade their privacy in order to help them. You have to be there constantly and be a support structure for them and help them turn to people. And sometimes it's little games. Talking back to my mother about some of the games she did, it's really funny. My mother is a classic psychologist, and I love her for this. And I should have known when I was younger, but when she was really frustrated with me, all of a sudden some of her friends would be hanging out. Right? I was like, huh. The aunt that I really liked would show up and come hang out during the day. Right? And my mom would set this thing up, but I didn't know what she was doing. All I know is that Aunt Kate was over again, and that was really cool. Because I thought Aunt Kate was awesome. And of course, I could, complain about Mom to Aunt Kate, and I knew that I trusted that. I didn't know that this was set up. These are things that parents can do to help create the environment in which it's really about providing the support structures that are there. Keeping kids away from adults doesn't do this, right? And it's not always the same age peers. In my case, my aunt was my mother's age, but it's about the older cousins. It's about the cohort who's the next generation up, and figuring out how to get mentors and getting mentors into kids' lives over and over again. For kids who are really at risk, we also have to think about other backup modes, right? And this is actually where I've been spending a lot of time talking to social services about how they have to get more active in this. They have to start engaging on these issues for when things are really going wrong. Guidance counselors have to get engaged on this. Big warning sign folks. And those are when things have really tipped off the edge. But it's really unfortunate. One of the things that drives me bonkers in the wealthiest segment of the U.S. Spectrum is how many parents think that the outlet for kids should always be a psychologist. Psychologists are not always the best outlet. Aunts and whatnot play a much better role. They're much more trusted than automatically sending your kid to therapy, right? Part of it is to find the balances where the kid is going to trust that adult. And that's why it's this isn't an ecology project. It's not like it's a matter of saying in or out, privacy or not. It's a matter of figuring out the right environment, because kids will turn to people when they need help.
To return to the question of bullying and harassment, it's not something that I've studied in an academic way, but you've seen a lot about it in the public media recently. I guess when we talk about privacy, it's usually framed in terms of I'm going to share X and I'm going to decide who I share it with about myself. In your interactions with teenagers, have you seen people be frustrated about information that's being posted about me, about which I have no control in a public forum, gossip taken outside of just hallway conversations into this public medium?
Right. Yeah. Yes. It's interesting. Your friends are your biggest risk for both privacy and security. And I think I'm going to start by getting away from the teenagers and bullying and kind of back into it. One of my favorite modes was watching all of this, the adults in the 50-plus range deciding they were going to create genealogy trees. Genealogy trees were great. And they were going to do these huge genealogy trees of all of their kids and all of their aunts and everybody else, and they were going to put them up online, thereby giving away everybody's mother's maiden name, right, without thinking about it. And I remember watching the sort of more technologically savvy going, yikes. So there's one is this kind of unintendedness, which actually happens all the time. I'm watching adults again see this online, which is that Your friends from high school think it's really funny to bring back all of those photos of you drinking with your friends, which is really great if you're a teacher, right? And all of a sudden you're dealing with these different dramas. And this is why, even at an adult level, we keep bringing things back because we understand our relationships in one context and don't think of it. Part of it is being able to have that conversation. Part of it is being able to have ways of technologically blocking it, right? And I'm glad when Facebook finally introduced the ability to like say, don't let anybody tag me until I say yes. That becomes really important as a baseline. But the problem with the bullying is that it's recognizing those structures and working around them to inflict harm. And that's actually where we get a new trick to it, right? Which is not just all of the unintended exposures that happen because of your friends, but the ones that are meant to be really malicious and hurtful. And this is, I think, one of the biggest struggles in figuring out this space. The interesting thing is it's not new, right? And so in the worlds of bullying, they've been dealing with this a lot longer. The difference is it's scaled more. So, it was about taking a compromising photo, recording a three-way phone call, all sorts of other ways that this happened before to embarrass people around the schoolyard. Most of these are still about embarrassing around the schoolyard, except the schoolyard is now visible to a much larger audience and with much longer-term complications. First thing that we have to deal with this is a whole set of education. We have to really get to the core of it. We also have to realize that bullying is often an escalation process. Most bullying is not just a victim and a perpetrator. It's a process of somebody smacking somebody and then taking it higher and higher and higher until it gets out of control. And so we also have to figure out how to actually make the right point of intervention and to figure out where this comes from. We have to figure out how to actually separate kids in schools. And I'm saying all of this because we don't know. Nobody has known how to deal with bullying. This is not a new thing. And adults have generally, historically, had two responses. Suck it up, kid, or fight back. Neither of which are actually going to be effective in this space at all. And I think, for those who are interested in bullying, there's an unbelievable conversation occurring right now between all sorts of researchers and mental health workers and whatnot, trying to figure out the right points of intervention. The thing the most interesting thing to keep in mind in this is that the rates of bullying don't appear to have been risen. What appears to be rising is the visibility of it. Right? So a lot of it is that we now can see a lot more bullying. Like if I came home with a black eye, my mom knew I was getting beaten up in school. But if I came home with a rumor being spread about me, I wasn't going to tell my mom. Now that's recorded and transmitted to a much wider audience. And we have to deal with all of the ways in which that becomes part of the psychological challenge. I don't have answers for you. I don't think anybody does. One of the things that kills me for all of those of you researchers, we haven't even been evaluating interventions. Right? There are no evaluated interventions in this space yet. I tried to do a call to try to find any of them. People are making interventions up in all sorts of schools, but not actually testing them about effectiveness. So anybody who's got that in their toolkit of methodologies, we desperately need those folks to figure out interventions and evaluate them. But we don't have answers. There's no doubt there's a lot of things to be worried about in this space. And the kids who are at risk are the kids who've been at risk in a whole variety of other ways. This is not new. So let's not just focus on the cyber, but back up and think about bullying. And this is just one new mode that's making it very visible, one new mode with a lot longer consequences, and one that I think we're all going to struggle with. I should note that there's a lot of pressure in this space to play a lot of basically cease and desist games with technology. I'm not sure this policy intervention is the right way. I think we need to back up and figure out the space before we do that, but I'm going to warn you that I think that you're going to see a lot of policy moves to argue for cease and desists, meaning I'm going to report this is bullying, take it down, which is just going to make a mess out of this whole space because that's also going to be used as part of the gaming of it. Keep in mind that bullying is very connected to gaming. It's a way of gaming systems. It's a way of gaming people. So limitations are often abused. A good example of this is that you and I were dating. You broke up with me. I'm really angry with you. So I'm going to gang up on all of these people. I say, hey, let's target you. And the way we're going to target you is we're going to send you text messages. And we're going to send text messages so that we go over your limit and you're in trouble with your parents. This is one of the weird backwards. Nobody who designed the ways of doing SMS expected that. But that's been a weird mess of this. So looking at all of the ways in which technology is being used gets us back to the fact that this is very intended. But it is a mess.
But it's fairly unique to them. Is it is it not reasonable to ask of people who are in these terrifying situations, I agree, to read what's printed on their screen?
The problem is that one, these things are not written in a way that are readable more often than not. Two, most of what's happening in the opt-in, opt-out space, you don't even necessarily get informed. You don't get informed that all of a sudden your material is appearing on Google because you didn't opt out to search crawlers being able to get access to it. I also don't think it's reasonable to assume that those who are most marginalized have the full responsibilities to deal with this. This is blaming the victim's game. I think this has been a long-standing problem in all sorts of different places. I also think that they're not the only ones who are actually being targeted by this. I think a lot of people who never would have intended for this are getting themselves in trouble. The thing about the opt-out, opt-in issue is that companies want you to automatically opt in for their economic incentives. I think by forcing it to be, forcing people to actually go through the process of deciding that they want to participate, forces the consumers to actually learn and forces the companies to basically demand that, or go out of their way to convince people that this is a good idea. It means that they have to articulate their game. They have to articulate what this is worth, and they have to do so in a really publicly important way, rather than just saying, hey, we're going to do this and we're not going to tell you why. And I think that really convincing users that this is to their benefit is very, very helpful in terms of creating an environment that we want to live in. I also think that, a lot of people who are dealing with this space have no sense of what's going on, can't see it, don't necessarily see it. The process of having to opt in means having to learn. And having to learn is actually a pretty important good thing in this space. I also think that a lot of these decisions that we make come with a level of privilege that comes from living in the US with a lot of ideas about our government that don't play out the rest of the world. It comes in with a lot of expectations and attitudes about advertisement, which we should call into question and say, is this really acceptable? And I think that making people have giving people a choice, giving them awareness of choice is absolutely critical. And that's why I think that making that move so that people aren't necessarily getting tricked into things they don't realize. I mean, how many people are going to see, instant personalizer without even realizing it because their data is there? I ran into this, a friend of mine who is obsessed with keeping content private, right? And I went to take screenshots for this talk. And I went and screenshot, I'm like, she's liking articles on the CNN. There's no way she knows this, right? So I copied and pasted a screenshot of it and sent it to her. And I was like, I know you read these policies, didn't you? And she's like, yes. And I was like, what do your settings look like right now? And she's like, well, I made everything turned off. And I'm like, yeah, except you didn't actually manage to opt out of this at the right time. She's like, right? And this is someone who just, for her own personal reasons, because of the job she's having, she doesn't want her likes out there. She had no idea. This is somebody with 4 degrees, right? Like, who can't figure this out. If somebody who's sitting here at the highest levels of the education bracket can't figure out how to make sense of this, we're not going to be expecting average users to do so. Nick Bilton at the New York Times and I spent the weekend just being like, can you make sense of this? I can't make sense of this. Can you make sense of this? No. This is somebody who's technologically savvy, who writes about technology, who can't figure this out. This is not something where it's just like, oh, well, they should just learn. When those of us who are most educated can't figure it out, that's not a good sign. That's not acceptable.
Just a quick general question. Security and privacy are often mentioned in the same breath, and I know of all kinds of students who are studying security in all kinds of wonderful curriculums. I don't know of any for privacy, and the privacy advocates I'm aware of are lawyers, computer scientists, different things. Could you talk a little bit about privacy as both a discipline and as a profession?
Sure. You're right. Most of it tends to come from the security world. There's the interesting stuff that's popping up tends to pop up in the humanities of all places. Helen Nissenbaum at the New York University in the media cultures and I forget what the actual title is. It's the media studies department there that changed its name, and they do an amazing job of this. They have a great privacy research group that's almost all humanists and lawyers and the sort of soft, squishy side of things. I think that it's not a discipline in and of itself. There are people, they are scattered. This is true of a lot of different things. Part of it is we scatter researchers, right? We don't try to make specialties in any particular school. And that's true in the social sciences and the humanities just like it is in computer science. I do think the conversations need to happen. I think that there's a lot of efforts being made to try to do this. I give a lot of credit to some of the stuff done by Ross Anderson to try to bring people together. A lot of credit to Bruce Schneier for trying to bring some of those worlds together in public discourse. But part of it is that the technology debates for a long time have been purely security. That's where a lot of this came from. Privacy as it relates to social is really new with social media. And so part of it is figuring out who's been talking about privacy historically and bringing them into the conversations with technology. It's coming from two totally different intellectual worlds, and they're starting to merge, but it's also taking time. For those of you who are working in this space, I think you have a great opportunity to start scouring the research. One of the things at the Berkman Center just put out a literature review of all privacy-related topics related to youth and media. It has an amazing bibliography. This is done, the first author on it is Alice Marwick. And it's an amazing compendium of a lot of things across both the technological space and a lot of the social space, trying to aggregate those people. I do think we need to start reaching out. In terms of teaching students, I think we have a big challenge, right? And I think that, as do our professors, look to the philosophy departments, look to some of the social sciences to see this. But, you can't expect that it's going to be at every university. So part of it is figuring out how to integrate that into it and to realize that the conversations that are happening in privacy are going to that are published are going to primarily predate technology. And figure out how to actually bridge those gaps is going to be an important endeavor for all of us.
I would suggest that the strongest technical privacy program might be CMU's CUPS lab, led by Lori Faith Craner.
Right, and that's CMU is doing amazing things out of the technical space and their policy space. Alessandro, who I mentioned a little earlier, is there. There's a lot of different interesting people there, but there's still some really interesting, important conversations in media studies and philosophy that don't get brought into CMU.
Hi, I wanted to ask you a question. You're talking about the dual role that a teacher or someone that's a role model to young people has. What do you do when you're in that role model, and many of us here may be in that situation, but it limits your ability to have a private Facebook in many ways, because all these privacy issues you're talking about, you're this role model to a group of people, and they have an expectation of what you are. And yet, it's not so easy to have the public and private Facebook things that you're talking about, but yet we're under tremendous pressure because so many things, like our universities are using Facebook for things, or our various schools are using Facebook, our various journals are using Facebook yet. So how do we have, and that, in a sense, can alter if you privately show a preference for things, that might not be what your public persona is to a group of people.
No, it is.
You see what I mean? You might not want to indicate to your students what your political values are, for example.
Right.
But you have, there's a real dichotomy because Facebook is becoming a stronger and stronger medium, not just for people who are teenagers, but for people who are in other types of groups too. And then if you have a double profile, what do you do?
It is. I will fully give you, it is a complete mess because the same challenges that we're dealing in terms of the ethics and dealing with this data, we have to deal with on a personal level in all of our classrooms and all of our spaces. It's interesting. I do actually believe that you end up having to maintain a certain kind of public face with certain roles that you have in society, whether you like it or not. And we think about this in communities as well. You may have gone out on a date. If you run into a student at the restaurant you're in, you're going to have to switch into role as teacher right there and right then, whether you like it or not. Right? And you may want to have your table moved, but you got to deal with it. You got to deal with those balances. We have to be having a conversation with parents about what this means and how to create boundaries. The limitations aren't going to come structurally, especially when a kid has decided to go after teachers. One of the most painful things in all of this is to watch teacher bullying occur. Right? Kids have always bullied teachers. This is not new. But kids are bullying teachers with the information that they can acquire online. And being able to hide from that is going to be very difficult. The question is how to actually keep and maintain face in a public way that you can really account for. With Facebook, I do actually think segmentation is your best bet. I think it's an unfortunate thing, but especially especially when you're dealing with wealthier communities where you've got helicopter parents that are going after you as a teacher, and this is true in the university level as well, you're going to have to actually sort of back it up and make certain it's scraped of those types of things. There's also something to be said about having a public view where everybody thinks that is your public view that allows you a private view. Angelina Jolie actually talks extensively about this when she was interviewed long ago about how she puts everything out in public. She just laughed and she said, no. The more I put out in public, the more I can maintain privacy. And I do it very actively so that I can actually keep things that are my own because I am in the spotlight. As a teacher and a whole variety of other roles, you are in a spotlight. And you have to deal with that. And you have to live with it. I mean, I have to live with the wonderful things I wrote about Usenet, on Usenet years ago. I have to, live with all the blog posts I've written since 1997. And part of it is keeping a public face and moving forward and continuing to produce content that I can stand up for and be proud of today and be like, yep, I wrote these things. Some of it I agree with of my past, some of it I don't. Let's move forward. And I think that the interesting thing is that we're going to see a lot more of that, the accounting of the past and a way of moving forward. I think this is one of the interesting things about how presidents, as it related to drugs, have played out in the United States for the last 3 presidents, right? I smoked but didn't inhale, round 1. Round 2, I did a lot of coke, but I found God and became religious, okay? Round 3, yeah, I did coke, but I messed up, and I was young, and can we move on now? And round 1, it was all over the media, right, in ways that are just unbelievable. Round 2 got some media coverage. By round 3, it didn't make it past the primaries in conversation. And part of it was the decision to say, look, yes, passed, can we move on? And when you can do that at a presidential level, I think we will do that over and over again at personal levels. And part of it is about putting more material out there that you can stand up by. And I think that if you put public stuff out, you allow yourself some privacy.
Hi. I like the way in the morning you put up the case that users don't allow for the metadata, which gets tagged along with their data. So an example can be the geographical information on Twitter. I'm somebody who's interested in doing research in such things. So what, should I stop doing research in such things, or what are the right practices to follow if I want to do research?
No, I mean, it's more a matter that you need to think through the ethics of what these things are. I don't know the specifics of your research project, but the challenge is to figure out, like, what are all of the unintended consequences of the things you're doing? What are you publishing? How are you publishing it? How are you doing it in ways that could harm people? How are you figuring out, like, what are these labels? What are the ways in which the metadata is accurate or not? What are the implications of it? How do you deal with it? The challenge is, if anything, take away from my call this morning is to think through these issues. Not to stop doing research, but to think through what this means for your work. And to think through all of the ways in which this can be misused, the ways it can hurt people. To think about the data that you're storing in your terabytes of drives and, like, what that means if it would get out. Like, thinking about all of these different levels, the kinds of levels that we should be thinking about as ethics, become really important. And thinking about the methodologies that you're using to look at this material and the claims that you're making with it. So no, don't stop doing this, but really think through it and think through how it's used. And think through what the consequences of it are and whether or not the people that you're observing using their data of know what's going on and whether or not it's okay that they do or don't, right? And it's going through that critical thinking process for your project. And finding a team within your community where you can actually bounce these ideas off and work through these issues and think about what it means to make the argument about why you did everything you did. Being able to stand up for what your decisions were and why you think that they're ethical and why you think they're important. And that's where these checks, these ethics checks, become absolutely essential.
Hi. This morning, Fred Stutzman ran a really great panel talking about the future of social networks. And there was some conversation there that I wanted to pull in here because it's all related. One of the folks on that panel, hey, Doc, worked for Facebook, and he was getting a little bit of challenge about, especially the recent, I forget what it's called, but like the big
instant
public...
personalizer and social
Yeah, that
logins.
thing, instant personalization. Also the person, I'm forgetting their names, but the person there on the panel who worked for Google was saying, well, what's the difference? I can give you my card and you can do anything with that. So what's the difference between sharing your, my stuff on my profile with a friend of mine who can see the same stuff on my profile? I thought this sort of missed the point that, especially that you've been making and in your talk at South by Southwest, between something that's public and something that has publicity. And
Right.
just because something is public doesn't mean I want it aggregated and promoted and things like that. And that it may be legal to do those things now. Whether it's ethical, we're not sure. And whether it's a good idea, I think a lot of us would probably think not. I think your point was to tell the social network corporations, like, you need to pay attention to this and figure this issue out. One of the things that I wanted to, one of the distinctions there that's missing too is that if someone gives me their card, A, there's a social contract about why they're giving me their card. It's not so I can photocopy it and put it in the staff bathroom or something. And B, it's a lot more work for me to do something inappropriate with it. And C, this comes back to the Facebook. I'm not going to do something inappropriate with it without my knowledge. which can happen now, as with your friend liking stuff on CNN, or if my mom doesn't, really keep up with her privacy settings and has access to my stuff, and then who knows what she does with it. So I think there's a very big difference. And then finally, to bring it back to sort of what's the future of this, also at South by Southwest, Chris Messina gave a good talk about activity streams, and I wonder if that, and in general more, are we ever going to get a chance to have open platforms, or are we totally stuck with these corporations like Facebook and Google that are just trying to monetize us? Or is there a future for some kind of open activity streams where we could have more control over our data?
So obviously, I agree with you on the first half of that. I think I'll go to the open platform stuff. Running these systems is hard, it is expensive, and it takes a lot of energy. And that's one of the reasons why I don't see them becoming open anytime soon in really reasonable ways. Sure, we could do certain things that are done in network ways. It's a great philosophy. But even just, the amount of money that goes in looking for child pornography on these sites is astonishing, right? And nobody wants the responsibility of being the ones hosting and serving that, which makes it really difficult. We can think about ways to architect peer-to-peer driven systems, but they become very difficult when you think about mobile, when you think about the ability that not everybody has servers, when you think about the moment that we talk about peer-to-peer, it quickly gets turned into peer-to-peer to cloud. And once we've got peer-to-peer to cloud, we got companies back in the game. So I'm not convinced that we're going to see truly open platforms used en masse anytime soon. Just because of all of the dynamics of it. I think that we will see open platforms used by the technological elite for all sorts of personal, private reasons. I think we can see these happening inside corporations. I think we'll see plenty of intranet-based systems that do different versions of this. But I don't think that they will become the mainstream things because of just what it means on a practical level for average people. And I think that things will be going more and more into the cloud, where we'll be dealing with this at a different level and far greater than that. So I think that working out these privacy issues, working out these accountability issues, working out what this means to deal with publicity, isn't just a matter of being solved by doing peer-to-peer systems or open systems. It really has to be worked out in the context of the fact that we are going to have big corporations doing this. In theory, we could have nonprofits doing it. Honestly, I don't think that we're going to see that anytime soon. There is something about incentives around money that motivate the top engineers to solve really hard problems. Facebook's architecture isn't easy. It was technologically hard, and it required some of the, the sort of biggest and the most technological savvy you could imagine to even get there. And so part of it is that the people that you're going to get to solve those problems are going to be people that are incentivized to make money. Of course, there are exceptions. I mean, Chris is a darling, but even Chris went to Google, right? So let's sort of think through what this means, that when we have to account for corporations as actors. As much as I love the liberal dream of moving towards a more open platform, I think we have to account for the very much realities of that average users are going to use what's convenient, and what's convenient is often going to be what's run by companies.
Okay. Appreciate your talk this morning, especially the, is it possible, but is it ethical? And so us as individuals can make sure that we're the nuclear engineers that put the lights on, not the ones that created the Hiroshima bomb. But one thing that was mentioned in the previous session in this room was, well, the nifty thing is that corporations can be treated as people. The thing is, I believe the book and the movie, The Corporation, said that if a corporation is a person, it's a sociopath. So we can't rely on it being ethical. How do we deal? You may have been explaining that already, but how do we deal with the fact that, if a corporation has a chance to make money, and a public corporation has a chance to make money, and they don't, they can be sued by their stockholders.
They can be sued by the when they're public.
Yes.
Let's account for that. So we also think about not just stockholders, but also stakeholders. Who are all the stakeholders in the game, and what does it mean? I mean, it is notable that Beacon was challenged as a collective class action suit, right? That should be noted in all of this, right? This is when some of the other stakeholders who are not the stockholders are speaking out and saying this is not acceptable. There are, of course, many different pathways to regulatory forces, and this is why one of the reasons I ended with Lessig, is I really think we come back to the issues of the market, the law, the technology, the code, and the social norms, and all of these different ways. Social norms are going to work really well when the people understand what's going on and they make a statement. That's actually what happened with some of newsfeed components. Social norms aren't going to work very well when people don't know how to speak up. But there's another thing that's really critical to social norms that I've been getting pushed back on, which I think is really important, which is that where is the press in all of this? We think of the press as a really important check and balance to a lot of systems. Who were the first people to sign up to be using social plugins and instant personalizer, right? The press. Why? Because they've got to figure out their future business model too. And they're very much reliant on these kinds of things working. And so they're not actually operating as the check and balance that we may necessarily like right now. So part of it is also thinking about how we use the technology to get information distributed, how we think about not necessarily replacing the press and amateur press and all of those conversations about bloggers, but what does it mean to actually allow for a way of social norms coming up? And what does it mean to think about the fact that we've got a lot of engineers in the space that actually are thinking critically about these issues? How can we compete on an engineering level? How can we compete on a marketing level to challenge this? What are all the pressures that are put onto companies to make privacy get worked out? I do think that, I don't know, is Danny here? There's this sort of interesting game about when legal threats of regulation are more powerful than actual regulation. There's something to be said about that. And I think that the fact that we're seeing this as a global environment where we're going to see threats happening, and the fact that law does take a long time to actually get worked through, means that we're going to see some of this boiling up. But I do think that we should be putting pressure on these institutions, these corporations, to think about how they're handling this. I think that we should be doing that as employees. I think we should be doing that as users. And I think that we all should be thinking through these. I mean, some of you actually work for these companies, right? I do, right? And I have in many different iterations. And part of it is really speaking up internally, speaking truth to power, and coming back and saying, hey, I don't think this is okay. Because all of us are, as employees for these companies, are also heavy stakeholders in the future of these companies. So figuring out all of these ways in which we can put pressure on it, and think about the ways in which we can build that collective action that we're building around the usage of them, to also think about the ways of being a pressure force is really important.
Thank you. You're divorced. The child goes back and forth between the two. And last night, this child blogged, "I'm not effing stupid. I know you're drunk. You're always drunk. I just wish you were ashamed." The mother saw that, figured out it was about her ex-husband who's drinking when she's over there. That's a whole new world. So it's just an anecdote I wanted to share. But the thing I wanted to talk about, I'm a parent of 15-year-old girls, and this is a value judgment on my part, but it almost feels like their behavior towards Facebook is addiction. And I'll get up at 11:30 at night and find that one of them's up and still Facebooking. And as someone who feels like our society is becoming more disconnected from the natural world, that's of real concern to me. So kind of wanted your feedback on it. Well,
most teenagers are, to abuse the psychological term, are addicted to social. They're addicted to their friends. They want to talk to their friends. It's great when I love in my fieldwork when I get to go hang out in schools, right? The moment the teacher turns around, everybody's like back to talking to their friends in any way possible, right? Break any whatever is supposed to be going on. It's all about friends. In American society, we've done an amazing job of keeping kids away from their friends, or putting them in very structured activities, or telling them that they can only interact with their friends in very formalist ways, right? In each other's house with a parent present, all of these different things. Kids are breaking out, trying to find ways of connecting to their friends in ways that are not controlled by adults. They're looking for it by any means possible. What's fascinating to me is that social network site use as a hangout place is most extreme in the communities where kids have the least access to their friends in flexible and unstructured ways. And so, and it's not just even your decisions as a parent, it becomes a collective decision. If your kids are allowed to go hang out with their friends whenever, but their friends aren't allowed to hang out with their friends, then it doesn't matter. Your kids are going to do whatever the social norm and pressure is. But the goal is that they want to get together, and they want to get together in an unstructured way that they can hang out. There are some uses that border more on what psychologists would refer to as addiction, but this tends to actually do things that are much more feedback like game style, where there's a psychological feedback component to it. The social is pure social connectionness. They don't want you listening in on the phone calls. They don't want you listening in on the text messages. They want to be just connecting and always connecting. And the thing is that technology allows them to connect at a greater level and without having to deal with distance. So we see this unbelievably boiling up and around that as a pressure. It is a real challenge. It's also really important to note that kids physically in the United States connect with kids less frequently than ever before in our history. You have less kids on average. You are less physically connected to other families on average. You are living further away from family on average. You have all of these ways in which kids are not always jumbled together. We have also lost a whole set of attitudes about go out, do whatever you want, be home by dark. That's really gone. That's really, really gone. We assume that the physical world is unsafe. And so the result of which is that we come in and see the kids playing it out online. Part of it, I think, as a society, especially if you're concerned about these physical opportunities, is that we have to really think about how to reconstruct environments in which kids can hang out with one another without it just being structured and formal in a sport, in an activity that's exactly structured this way, and give them that flexibility. It's one of the big reliefs that I have whenever I go to certain parts of Europe, and I spend a lot of time in Israel these days. Cafe culture, beautiful thing. Kids aren't shooed away, right? It does wonders for kids hanging out. Yeah, they've got their mobiles with them all the time. They're always connected. They're sharing information. But their social network site usage looks very different because they can hang out in person. Even compare Southern Europe to the UK, which looks a lot more like the US and all of its sort of fear-mongering. And we see all this more social network site use. So part of it is to realize that kids are doing the same thing across the board. Where they're doing it and how they're doing it has to do with the cultural context. And if you don't like the fact that it's all going on online, really rethink what your community is doing for the environments that you're building for kids. And rethink what it would mean to give kids back public spaces where they can hang out, that are not just commercial or where they're not shooed out, where there's not stupid buzzing things. I mean, those mosquitoes are horrible, right? Like little buzzing things when you try to go into 7-Eleven, and it twitches. Like I can't believe the amount of time we do try to kick kids out of physical spaces. It's interesting. This is also, if you want to read a great book on this, Jill Valentine with a G, G-I-L-L, Valentine wrote a beautiful book called Public Space and the Future of Childhood or something like this. And she accounts all of these different stories about how we moved in the early 1980s to get kids out of public space. One of my favorite elements of this as I investigated all of this, were these great reports around delinquency and gang violence and whatnot. And the mayor of New Orleans stated that, this is a violent place. We need to get kids out of the public spaces for all sorts of violence reasons. 3 years later, it came back and said, well, we kicked kids out, violence went up. What do you think about this? Well, we're still better off without kids in public spaces. It's like, okay, wait a minute. So what are we actually trying to do, or what are we trying to accomplish, and how do we actually look at it? Curfew laws, since the 1980s, skyrocketed. You're a gang if you're more than 3 people in huge numbers of places all across the country. So I'd say look at your local community, think about the structure you're building there, and push back against that, and realize that technology is what's coming out as a result of these moves that we made in the 80s.
Amazingly, she has held the stage for an hour and a half. For those of us that were watching, it went by very fast. I hope it was okay for you too. But our time has wrapped up. I'm sure she'll stay if you have any more questions privately. But let's thank her very much.